Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in for the Commander's Core Studio. Welcome to the show. So I've actually gotten the question quite a few times, hey Mitch, what was your first Commander deck? What was your first personal deck that you ever built and played? And because it seems like people are interested in that answer and the question keeps coming up, I decided to make an episode on it. Now with my very first deck and my only deck at the time, I did start it off as a very budget deck, but in a couple of weeks I started adding more and more cards to it. Now at the time, obviously I wasn't the most experienced Commander deck builder because yeah, this was the first deck I ever built, so I made some mistakes along the way. Regardless, I was able to dig back through my deck list and find the closest list to my original list that I could. So today, just for fun, I'm going to take you through that list. Keep in mind that a lot of the prices on the cards from this deck have skyrocketed since I originally built the deck a long time ago. Also, keep in mind that I'd be making some more adjustments to this deck, like adding in some more targeted removal if I was going to rebuild it today, but yeah, you live and you learn, okay? Regardless, my very first commander that I built a deck around was Rishkar Pima Renegade. Rishkar is a 2/2 elf druid that costs 2 and a green, and when it enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on up to 2 target creatures. But the important part here is that each creature you control with a counter on it has tap add green. So with a counter strategy and a lot of creatures in play, you can make an absurd amount of mana thanks to this commander. And yeah, generating an absurd amount of mana and casting some really big and exciting spells was definitely something that appealed to me when I first started playing Commander. So now let's talk about the cards in the deck and how this deck works in general. First off, I utilized some low-to-the-ground mana dorks like Llanowar Elves, Finehorn Elves, and Elvish Mystic. Each of them are essentially the exact same card, a 1/1 Elf Druid for a green that can tap to add green. So by getting these down on turn 1, you can get your commander out on turn 2 if you really want to. In a similar way, Boreal Druid and Arbor Elf can also help you do the same. Boreal Druid taps for a colorless, and Arbor Elf taps to untap target forest. And then Draga Tree Speaker is another 1-drop that can help us out in a different way. She has level up for 1 and a green, and between levels 1 and 4, she can tap to add green to your mana pool, but if she gets to 5+, all of your elves can tap to add green to your mana pool. And obviously, as you've already seen so far, including our commander, we've got quite a few elves in this deck. Next up though, there's Karametra's Acolyte, a 1/4 human druid for 3 and a green, and it can tap to add an amount of green to your mana pool equal to your devotion to green. Yeah, in a mono green deck, this can tap for an absurd amount of mana. Speaking of which, there's Gyre Sage, a 1/2 elf druid with Evolve that has tap add green for each +1/+1 counter on Gyre Sage. So the more counters that we get on this creature, and yeah, there are plenty of ways for us to do that in this deck, the bigger it gets and the more it taps for mana. We can also utilize counters in a different way though with Vertilid. It's going to come into play with 2 +1/+1 counters on it, and by paying 1 and a green, you can move a +1/+1 counter from it and search our library for a basic land and put it onto the battlefield tapped. So if we can keep replenishing those counters, we can keep getting more and more lands into play by paying 1 and a green. But outside of these creatures, we also had other ways to help us with mana as well. So first up, let's talk about Ronus' Monument, a legendary artifact for 3 that says green creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. On top of that, whenever you cast a creature spell, target creature you control gets +2/+2 and gains trample until end of turn. So obviously this helps us out in multiple ways. First off, yeah, we've got a lot of green creatures in this deck, so this can reduce their cost quite a bit. But on top of that, this can also make our creatures even deadlier because when we cast those creature spells, we can pump a creature and give it trample. Next up, let's talk about Harvest Season, which is an incredible card in this deck. It's a sorcery for 2 and a green, and it says, search your library for up to X basic land cards, where X is the number of tapped creatures you control, and put those cards onto the battlefield tapped. Again, our commander essentially can turn every single one of our creatures into a mana dork, so we can just tap them for a bunch of mana, and then cast this, and then get a ton of basic lands into play. So we don't even have to put our creatures in harm's way during combat to actually, have them tapped. And we can also utilize our creatures multiple times in a trip around the table with Quest for Renewal. It's an enchantment for 1 and a green that says whenever a creature you control becomes tapped, you may put a quest counter on Quest for Renewal. And as long as there are 4 or more quest counters on quest renewal, we untap all creatures we control during each other player's untap step. Getting 4 counters on this is a piece of cake, so yeah, it's basically kind of like a Seedborn Muse, but just for our creatures. But now that we've talked about ways to generate mana advantage, let's talk about some ways to generate card advantage. And ironically, the first card I'm going to talk about, Zendikar Resurgent, deals with both mana advantage and card advantage. It's an enchantment for 5 green and it says whenever you tap a land for mana, add 1 mana to your mana pool of any type that land produced, so essentially it doubles up our lands. But on top of that, it also says whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. So yeah, this can be huge in both ways for our deck. And then Primordial Sage is a creature that essentially has that exact same part. Again, whenever you cast a creature spell, you may draw a card. The more and more creatures that we cast, the more and more we churn through our deck with these. And Soul to Harvest can help us out as well in a very similar way. It's a 6/6 Trampler that says whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. So yeah, these cards can definitely be huge draw engines for this deck. But we can also get a big burst of cards all at once with cards like Shamanic Revelation and Collective Unconscious. Shamanic Revelation says draw a card for each creature you control, and it's got Ferocious, you gain 4 life for each creature you control with power 4 or greater. So not only can this draw us a lot of cards, but if we pump up our creatures with some counters, yeah, it can gain us a lot of life as well. And then Collective Unconscious is essentially just the first part of that last card, but yeah, it's still very effective in a deck that's running an absurd amount of creatures. But perhaps an even better card in this deck is Slate of Ancestry. It has pay 4, tap, discard your hand, draw a card for each creature you control. So this is a repeatable way to draw a ton of cards. And although we have to discard our hand to do so, it's going to be well worth it. And then we've got some cards that can draw us a number of cards based off of a certain restriction with Regal Force, Armorcraft Judge, and Mouth to Feed. Regal Force says when it enters the battlefield, draw a card for each green creature you control. The vast majority of our creatures are going to be green, so yeah, almost all of them we're going to be drawing a card for. And then Armorcraft Judge says as it enters the battlefield, draw a card for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Again, this deck is built around those types of counters, so yeah, we've got plenty of ways to get a lot of counters on our creatures and draw a ton from this. And then while Mouth doesn't draw us any cards, it just makes us a 3/3 Hippo, which is nice. Feed definitely can draw us a lot of cards. It says draw a card for each creature you control with power 3 or greater. And yeah, again, like I mentioned before, even with our smallest creatures, we obviously have ways to make them even bigger, so we can count them with this. But next up, let's talk about what is, in my opinion, the best card in this deck, the golden pig of the deck, with Inspiring Call. Inspiring Call is an instant 4/2 and a green, and it says draw a card for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Those creatures gain indestructible until end of turn. This is a game-changing card, to say the least. Like I mentioned before, we've got plenty of ways to get a lot of counters on all of our creatures. So for just 3 mana at instant speed, we can draw a ton of cards. On top of that, those creatures gain indestructible, so yeah, this is basically board wipe protection that draws us an absurd amount of cards. It is an absolutely unparalleled and incredible card in this deck, and that's why it's the Golden Pig. But to round out our card advantage spells, let's talk about Rishkar's Expertise and Lifeblood Hydra. Rishkar's Expertise says draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control, and you may cast a card with converted mana cost 5 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. So whereas our other cards really cared about the amount of creatures in play, this one cares about the biggest creature we've got in play. And again, on top of that, it lets us cast something for free too. And then Lifeblood Hydra also cares about power, but just for itself. It's a 0/0 Hydra with Trample that enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it, and when it dies, you gain life and draw cards equal to its power. So yeah, this can be a heavy hitter, and then when it's dealt with, well, we can just gain a ton of life and draw a ton of cards. But now let's move on and talk about some other creatures that deal with +1/+1 counters. First up, we've got some 1-drops with Servant of the Scale and Experiment 1. Servant of the Scale is going to enter the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it, and when it dies, we put X of its counters onto target creature we control, where X is the number of counters on Servant of the Scale. And then Experiment 1 is a 1/1 that has Evolve, and by removing 2 counters from it, we regenerate it. So actually, as things get going, this little card can get pretty hard to deal with. Speaking of which, we've also got Mold Adder, Scoop Mob, and Endless One. Mold Adder says whenever an opponent casts a blue or black spell, you may put a +1/+1 counter on Mold Adder. In a game of Commander, yeah, blue and black are 2 of the most popular colors, and chances are at least one of your opponents, if not 2 or even 3, are going to be running them. And whenever they do, this tiny little 1-drop is going to grow. And then Scoop Mob can grow in a different way. It's a 1/1 that says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 5 more lands, put 4+1 counters on Scoop Mob. So this can become an absolute monster in no time. Speaking of which, there's Endless One, which is a 0/0 Eldrazi that just costs X, and it enters the battlefield with X+1 counters on it. So if we just want to utilize it as a small mana dork, well, we can just, pay 1 for it, and then it can be utilized with Rishkar. Or, we can put a ton of mana into it, and it can be a huge threat. But now let's move on and talk about some other creatures that can grow throughout the game with Lumberknot, Titania's Chosen, and Managorger Hydra. Lumberknot is a 1/1 with hexproof, but it says whenever a creature dies, put a +1 counter on Lumberknot. So this can be really hard to deal with, and it can grow really quickly, really fast, especially against certain decks. And then Titania's Chosen is a 1/1 that says whenever a player casts a green spell, put a +1 counter on Titania's Chosen. So this not only counts our green spells, but our opponents as well. But then Managorger Hydra takes this to a different level, a 1/1 Hydra Trample that says whenever a player casts a spell, put a +1 counter on Managorger Hydra. So yeah, this counts any spell, any and every spell, including all of our opponent's spells, and it's got Trample. So yeah, this is gonna get big really quick. Up next, though, we've got Reverent Hunter, Predator Ooze, and Phantom Nantuko that can grow for different reasons. Reverent Hunter is just a 1/1, but when it enters the battlefield, we put a number of +1 counters on it equal to our Devotion to Green. Again, in a mono green deck, we're going to have plenty of Devotion to Green, so this can be a really huge creature for just 3 mana. And speaking of Devotion to Green, there's Predator Ooze, which, costs green, so that could help us out quite a bit with that. It's a 1/1 indestructible ooze, and when it attacks, we put a +1 counter on it. And then whenever a creature dealt damage by Predator Ooze this turn dies, put a counter on Predator Ooze. So very simply, we just keep attacking with this and growing it, and it can become a huge threat. Next up, there's Phantom Nantuko, which is a 0/0 that enters the battlefield with 2+1 counters on it, and it's got Trample. It also says if damage will be dealt to Phantom Nantuko, prevent that damage, remove a +1 counter from it. And by tapping it, we can put a +1 counter on Phantom Nantuko. So this can really help us out in combat and be pretty hard to deal with as well, and we can grow it throughout the game just by tapping it. We've also got some creatures that can help us share some counters with Scrounging Bandar, Aquasaran Spider, and Cytoplast Rootkin. Scrounging Bandar is a 0/0 that comes into play with 2 counters on it, and at the beginning of our upkeep, we can move any number of counters from Scrounging Bandar onto another target creature. And then Aquasaran Spider and Cytoplast Rootkin both have Graft. Graft means that this creature enters the battlefield with a certain number of counters on it, and then whenever another creature enters the battlefield, we can move a counter from this creature onto it. Aquasaran Spider has Graft too, so that's 2 counters, and by paying a green, we can give target creature with a +1 counter on it, reach until end of turn. And then Cytoplast Rootkin has Graft 4, and whenever it enters the battlefield, we get a +1 counter on each other creature we control with a +1 counter on it. On top of that, by paying 2, we can move a +1 counter from target creature we control onto Cytoplast Rootkin. So yeah, this creature especially has some really effective counter synergies. And speaking of counter synergies, let's talk about Ridgescale Tusker, Primeval Protector, and Renegade Crassus. Ridgescale Tusker is a 5/5, and when it enters the battlefield, we put a +1 counter on each other creature we control. So essentially, this creature is, hey, every creature except for this one is now a mana dork thanks to our commander. And in a similar way, there's Primeval Protector, which is a 10/10 for 10 and a green, but it's going to cost us a lot less to cast. Because it costs 1 less to cast for each creature our opponents control, so yeah, a lot of the time this can just cost us a singular green for a 10/10 that also has, when it enters the battlefield, play +1 counter on each other creature you control. Another way for us to get more counters onto things, though, comes with Renegade Crassus. It's a 3/2 with Evolve, and whenever it evolves, we put a +1 counter on each other creature we control with a +1 counter on it. So if we keep casting bigger and bigger creatures, this keeps growing and growing our other creatures as well. Another card that can really help us out, though, is Retreat to Kazandu. It's an enchantment that has landfall. Whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, choose 1, put a +1 counter on target creature, or you gain 2 life. Most of the time, we're probably going to pick that first option, but it's always nice just to have a second option with, hey, if I need some life, I can have it. A card that can help us out in a big burst, though, is Strength of the Tajiru. It's an instant with multi-kicker 1, and it says choose target creature, then choose another target creature for each time this spell is kicked, put X+1 counters on each of them. So actually, we can utilize this as a combat trick if we really want to. But an even more devastating card in this deck can be Solidarity of Heroes. It has Strive for 1 and a green, and it says choose any number of target creatures, double the number of +1 counters on each of them. So yeah, this can come out of absolutely nowhere and make a lot of our creatures huge. And we actually have some creatures that can really help us out with more and more counters with Ivy Lane Denizen and Forgotten Ancient. Ivy Lane Denizen says whenever another green creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1 counter on target creature. Again, we're going to have a lot of green creatures coming into play, so yeah, this can help us out quite a bit. But then Forgotten Ancient can be even bigger in this deck. It's a 0/3 that says whenever a player casts cast a spell, you may put a +1 counter on Forgotten Ancient. But on top of that, at the beginning of your upkeep, you may move any number of +1 counters from Forgotten Ancient onto other creatures. So Forgotten Ancient can essentially guarantee that all of our creatures can be mana dorks with our commander, and yeah, it can definitely grow specific ones to be huge. And of course, Hardened Scales is a very fantastic card in pretty much any +1 counters build. It's an enchantment for just a green, and it says if one or more counters we put on a creature you control, that many +1/+1 counters are put on it instead. So yeah, if we get this down early, it essentially doubles up the effectiveness of a lot of our cards. But as we're building our board, we also want to make sure that we can protect it as well. So let's talk about cards like Sporeback Troll, Temur Sabertooth, and Soul of New Phyrexia. Sporeback Troll has Graph 2, and it has pay 1 and a green, and regenerate target creature with a +1 counter on it. Yeah, this can really help us out in a pinch in saving a specific creature or two. Speaking of which, there's Temur Sabertooth, which has pay 1 and a green. You may return another creature you control to its owner's hand. If you do, Temur Sabertooth gains indestructible until end of turn. So this is a fantastic way to bounce a creature back to safety and to our hand. And at the same time, when we do that, this protects itself. Also, keep in mind that we've got a good amount of creatures in this deck that have ETBs, so yeah, we can utilize those really heavily with this. Or, you know, we can just protect all of our things with Soul of New Phyrexia. It's a 6/6 with trample that has pay 5, permanents you control gain indestructible until end of turn. And even if it's in our graveyard, it can help us out as well, because by paying 5, we can exile it from our graveyard, and permanents we control gain indestructible until end of turn. But yeah, with this kind of a deck, we can easily keep up enough mana to just keep doing this over and over again if it's in play. But if someone does deal with our board, we can easily refill it very quickly with Call of the Claw. It's a 2/2 elf with flash that says when it enters the battlefield, put a 2/2 green bear creature token onto the battlefield for each non-token creature put in your graveyard from the battlefield this turn. And then Whisperwood Elemental is somewhat similar in a way. It's a 4/4 elemental that says at the beginning of your end step, manifest the top card of your library. And by sacrificing it until end of turn, face up non-token creatures you control gain. When this creature dies, manifest the top card of your library. But even if we're not protecting creatures or replacing them, we can gain a lot of benefits from them dying with something like Lateheart Cavalry. When it enters the battlefield, we support 6, and then whenever a creature we control with a +1 counter on it dies, we gain 2 life. So this can distribute a ton of counters and gain us a lot of life throughout the game. We can also protect our board in a different way though with Joriel, Empress of Beasts. By paying 2 and a green, we can tap and discard 2 cards, and until end of turn, all lands target player controls are 3/3 creatures that are still lands. Essentially, if someone tries to wrath the board, we just activate this, and now all their lands are creatures, and their lands are gone. So yeah, that is a fantastic way to deter our opponents from actually trying to cast a wrath. And then Yeva Nature's Herald helps us out in a different way. It's a 4/4 elf shaman that has flash and says you may cast green creature cards as though they had flash. So with this, we can somewhat protect our board position by waiting until just before our turn and then casting a lot of green creatures. But some other cards that can help us out with this deck are Den Protector, Anok Survivalist, and Azuri's Predation. Den Protector is just a 2/1, but it also says creatures with power less than Den Protector's power can't block it. It's also got Megamorph for 1 and a green, and when it's turned face up, we return target card from our graveyard to our hand. So yeah, this can be a fantastic way to recover a card that we, well, lost. And then Anok Survivalist also has Megamorph for 1 and a green, and when it's turned face up, we destroy target artifact or enchantment opponent controls. But we can really wipe our opponent's boards with something like Azuri's Predation. It says for each creature your opponents control, create a 4/4 green beast creature token. Each of those beasts fights a different one of those creatures. Basically, every single creature that has a toughness of 4 or less is dead. And each of those creatures that had power less than 4, well, we get a beast that survives that. So this can be a board wipe that can also set us up to win by giving us a giant army of beasts. But speaking of ways that we can finish off our opponents, let's talk about some cards like Wolfbriar Elemental, Sandworm Convergence, and Colossus of Akros. Wolfbriar Elemental is a 4/4 elemental with multi-kicker green. When it enters the battlefield, create a 2/2 green wolf creature token for each time it was kicked. Again, with this deck, we can generate an absurd amount of mana, so say hello to a giant wolf army. And then let's talk about a different kind of army with Sandworm Convergence. It's an enchantment that says creatures with flying can't attack you or planeswalkers you control, so yeah, that's really nice. And on top of that, at the beginning of your end step, you get a 5/5 green worm creature token. So not only does this protect us, but over time it can generate us an army of worms. But we might not need an army if we've got something like Colossus of Akros. It's a 10/10 with Defender and Indestructible, but by paying 10, it has Monstrosity 10. And as long as it's monstrous, it has Trample and can attack as though it didn't have Defender. So yeah, a 20/20 trampling Indestructible Golem. Have fun, opponents. And of course, we got some ways to make our army even deadlier with things like Overwhelming Stampede and Beastmaster Ascension. Overwhelming Stampede says, until end of turn, creatures you control gain trample and get +X/+X for X the greatest power among creatures you control. So just think about that with Colossus of Akros in play. Yeah, that's a lot of fun. And then Beastmaster Ascension is an enchantment that says whenever a creature you control attacks, you may put a quest counter on Beastmaster Ascension. As long as it's got 7 or more quest counters on it, creatures you control get +5/+5. Just with this in play and with a few creatures attacking, our army can become deadly in absolutely no time. But we've also got some creatures that can help out as well with Cultivator Blades, Decimator Provinces, and Champion of Lambhold. Cultivator Blades is just a 1/1, but it does have Fabricate too, so yeah, we can get 2 servos if we want, or get 2 counters on it. Regardless, whenever it attacks, we can have other attacking creatures get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is Cultivator Blades' power. So by growing this, we make our entire army deadlier. Speaking of which, Decimator Provinces is a 7/7 with a merge for 6 green. It's got Trample and Haste and says when we cast it, creatures we control get +2/+2 and gain Trample until end of turn. So this can be a huge threat in itself, but yeah, also just can grow our army and make them deadlier. And then there's Champion of Lambhold, which is a 1/1 human warrior that says creatures with power less than Champion of Lambhold's power can't block creatures you control. On top of that, whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1 counter on Champion of Lambhold. So by growing this a decent amount, our creatures are essentially just unblockable. But now that we've talked about all the non-land cards in this deck, it's time for us to move on to the lands. First up, there's Colony Guardian, which enters the battlefield tapped, but it does give us a 0/1 plant creature token, and it taps for a green. And then Land of Reborn also enters the battlefield tapped, and it taps for a green, but it's got Graft 1. And then Ornate the Vastwood can get even more counters on our creatures because it has tap, put a +1 counter on each green creature that enters the battlefield this turn. Next up, let's talk about Tranquil Thicket, which enters the battlefield tapped, taps for a green, and cycles for a green. And then Arch of Vraska has Ascend, and it taps for a colorless, and we can pay 5 and tap to draw a card, but only if we've got the City's Blessing. And then Monster Bridge has Hideaway, which means that it enters the battlefield tapped, and when it does, we look at the top 4 cards of our library, and we exile one of those face down, then put the rest in the bottom of our library. It taps for a green, but we can also pay green and tap it, and play the exile card without paying its mana cost if creatures we control have total power of 10 or greater, which, yeah, in this deck is really easy for us to meet. And finally, of course, we've got to run some basic lands as well, so we're going to be running 27 Forests. Now, as for the price of this deck, like I mentioned, it's been quite a few years since this deck actually was built, and yeah, at the time, it was definitely a lot more budget than you see it here. So according to Scryfall, currently the estimated price is around $123.02. Now, keep in mind that this does include basic lands, which are valued at 10 cents a piece, and yeah, it's also not including any cards that are heavily played or damaged on TCG Player, so just keep all that in mind, please. So if you optimize this deck, you might be able to get a better price for it. But also keep in mind that this doesn't include shipping, so depending on where you're at, that can definitely vary. Regardless, yeah, it's really interesting to look back and see some of the cards in this deck that used to be a lot more budget, like Hardened Scales, Quest for Renewal, Beastmaster Ascension. Just even looking in that column, you see quite a few. But yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on my very first Commander deck, and keep in mind that again, this was my first Commander deck, so I have learned quite a bit since. So let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below, and of course, as always, thanks again and have a good one.